I would like you to introduce yourself and then give us a little background about your bio and tell us in what kind of mediation you have been involved in.
Thank you. My name is Ruth Bolline, Aluoch. I'm Kenyan. Currently, I work with the United Nations as a political and gender affairs officer. I work in the Department of Peace Operations. Previously, I worked with the Department of Peace Building, but specifically with the Mediation Support Unit. But I've also been at the International Peace Support Training Center, where I extensively did research and trained on mediation, dialogue, mediation, and negotiation, which basically entailed a lot of mentorship and preparation for mediators. But then in my first career path working with the government of Kenya, that's where I was involved a lot in different forms of mediation and negotiation processes. By way of maybe education, I have a master's in international peace and security, a bachelor's in law, and extensive training on diplomacy, on peace building, conflict management, and related security arrangements. I think that is sufficient for this purpose.
Well, that's quite a bit. It's a mouthful, actually, so I can see where the dynamism comes in. Considering this particular extensive experience that you've had, so as an African mediator, do you think that your approach to mediation is impacted by particular ideals that are implicit to your cultural background?
As an African woman, yes, I think and I believe my cultural values impact my approach to mediation. And I'd say this because I think my first experience in mediation was basically by default, and much more because the person who was meant to do the work at the last minute could not, and I was assigned to take up the responsibilities. And this was a process that touched on cultural two communities. And so by me going into the process, there was the issue first of am I culturally correct in their lens? Is my value system in tandem with their values in terms of their worldview and perceptions? There was the cultural element associated also with gender and my place as a woman, but there was also the value of probably I don't know how I would call it, but the social values, the relational element, which helps us to see things beyond the transactions of just getting to the process, generating a decision, and looking at how do I build the relations and how do I keep things going for the greater good of the communities and these societies. So yes, and another thing I would consider is that in my first initial phases, which subsequently when I start to reflect on, I realized that my upbringing also had a significant bearing on how do you engage with people, how do you listen, at what point do you speak up. And these are not things that will always happen in all formal mediation processes, but they're things that you have to really reflect. It has to be a part of you. And then when a situation arises, you can read through the lenses and apply it.
You raised some very important points, and I have to ask then, is it therefore that your ability to read the situation based on the culture and the, what shall I say, values of the people with whom you are mediating gives you legitimacy?
Yes and no. The reality is when you're able to read through the situation, in a formal sense, reading through a situation in the contemporary times, it's always a question of, okay, let me do my research, let me do my analysis, let me understand. But the moment you, and especially I say this from an African viewpoint, the things we see on the surface are not always the same, the way they are interpreted when you start to unpack. And sometimes there are things we would see, but when you talk to segments of a people, you look at it from different angles. And there is information that you will only get when you speak, you engage and connect with people and communities from where they are. Such that if my process, for instance, is in Cape Town, and the communities I am handling it operate from some village in South Africa, believe you me, by me going down to their space, operating in their huts and tiny spaces, I will pick things, you're able to sieve, to filter, you are able to feel it, you're able to understand it. And then when you step back with your expertise and your experience, you can connect the different dots and you can actually know this would be the ideal approach for me to steer this process, or it will be the ideal approach within which I can support this process. But in the current times, often at times, a lot of work is done from afar, from our comfort, from our own zones, on the premise that we need to be away, we want to put the process away from spoilers or from individuals who may infiltrate it. Of course, it has its own benefit, but there is the cultural element that we lose out in the process and could be very strategic and very impactful in addressing some of the issues that are going on in a situation.
So based on this, it shows that you have a very particular, a grasp or understanding of the mediation process, especially when it deals with these nuances. And in African societies, African communities, they have their own understanding of different things. Would you then therefore say that in the mediation process and in your experience as a mediator, you will then channel your own values during the mediation process, or is there a tendency to stick with the particular ideals and formats of mediation? So, for example, you mediating on behalf of the Kenyan government, will you stick to their ideals and formats, or would you bring your own values to the mediation process?
I come from a school of thought, and even by experience, no mediation process is cast on stone. Any mediation process should be flexible and should be able to be agile, and it evolves because as the context, as the situation, as the rules of the game evolve, so should the mediator. But one of the things I want to say about value setting before any process begins, it is very important to be very clear what values, what processes, what ideals are we going to function with in this process. If I am going in a process, in this case, in my capacity as a Kenyan government official, or in my capacity, let's say, as IGAD, or even in a capacity as civil society, before you embark on a process, and this is so much important to be on the same page. Whichever authority is you're going with, you have to really be clear what are the values that we are taking forward as we embark on this process. It has to be clear. And as you start engaging with the other actors, some of these ideals should be clearly spelled out. The problem will always come when some of these things are not spelled out. Along the way, situations may change, things may crop up, and you have to revisit. Is it a value that I'm actually like changing, or is it my approach or my strategy, and what does it mean for the values that we are set out to do? So even when you are going in as part of as part of a country's representative, for instance, the assigning authorities should always have an idea. This is what I am going, these are fairly the parameters of my work, and this is the parameter of my value system. Sometimes we'd agree, sometimes we'll not agree. But I think from a value-based approach, it hasn't been such a challenge because there are always notions of impartiality, notions of inclusion, notions on accommodation, sensitivities. Some of these values are really universal, save there are those that sometimes can be very contentious. And when you see that, you also have to take a step back, because again, in formal process, we try to assume that there is a script that should define mediation. But because each process is unique, all parties of all these different negotiation processes, they are always very distinct. Their temperaments in one phase may be different from their temperaments in their subsequent phases. So it means even for you as a mediator, you should have the tact and the intelligence to pick all these things and know at what point will this be strategic for my purposes, and at what point should I not use and employ this, because it will basically, it may distract your process, or it may jeopardize your options or your opportunity for moving forward or for being successful in anything that you're doing. So yeah, I think that would be it.
Okay, so when you say that you need to make sure that they understand your values, is this with regards to the parties that you're mediating with as well? And on whose, whilst you're sitting there with them, you explain to them that these are the values that we come with, this is what we're going to do. And if there is a particular value that, say, a party has a problem with that particular value, how do you then overcome that challenge?
When it comes to the values, especially with the parties to conflict, there is always behind the scene processes. Before even the processes begin, you're engaging these parties before you start the process. And as you engage them, you also want them to know where you're coming from and where you would like to go, and probably the hows, because you're trying to win them over for them to be part of